Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this media conference organized by the National Congress of Chinese Canadians, NCCC. I'm very honored today to be here with my friend, Howard Grant. He is the Executive Director of the First Nations Summit. As you all know, we have Canada Day before us. And this is a particularly reflective year for Canada, because of recent happenings in the discoveries of the unmarked graves in BC of 215 unmarked graves, and further in Saskatchewan of the 751 unmarked graves. So for those who don't know, I will just use a sentence to describe NCCC. NCCC was formed in 1992, particularly for the purpose of fighting for the redress and apology of the Chinese head tax, which attained...
You're covering your camera.
Oh, sorry. Should I start again or not?
No,
Just continue?
keep going.
Okay. NCCC was started in 1992 for the purpose of fighting for the Chinese head tax redress, which Parliament gave an apology through the Prime Minister then in 2006. So NCCC have always been fighting for the rightful rights of Chinese Canadians. Now, I also want to mention that NCCC has 6 chapters across Canada, and that is the Pacific, Alberta, Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic. And we are a national organization. This Canada Day is a time for Canadians to remember and reflect on our First Nations history, to commit to learn Canada's First Nation people's history and from Canada's mistakes, to reconcile with justice and social justice, to seek truth and reconciliation. The National Congress of Chinese Canadians stands with our First Nations friends in remembrance of the tragic loss of their loved ones, especially of their missing women and children and their unknown deaths in great numbers. Once again, at this time up on the discoveries of large numbers of unmarked graves. This is a nationally sad and challenging time in Canada. In Canadian history, when Chinese were severely and indiscriminately discriminated against, it was our First Nations friends who treated us as equals, offer us warmth and comfort, and in kindness with compassion and friendship. We held cultural exchanges, and perhaps this is the first truly positive cultural exchange that have taken place between different peoples in Canada, in Canadian history. We exchanged herbal medicine, cooking and culinary art, hand sewing and clothes making, and in farming and irrigation. The First Nations people offered the compassion and friendship sincerely to the Chinese who needed help in sickness, as the Chinese could not access hospitals and medicine because of the color of their skin. It was the First Nations people who let the Chinese farm on their land to survive. And least we forget. The National Congress of Chinese Canadians stands with the First Nations people of Canada at this sad and challenging time in Canadian history. I would also like to add that in Canada, we indeed have many things that we should cherish and to celebrate. One of them is our very much cherished and respected Charter of Rights and Freedom. But we must not forget what is happening in Canada at this time and what the First Nations people have been telling Canadians for a long time about the missing women and about the horrific stories from the survivors of the indigenous residential schools And yet it has taken to 2021 for the government to take it up seriously. And that is through the radar detection of the unmarked graves, which should have done a long, long time ago. And as we proceed, I must urge our Canadian government to expedite, to seek truth, and to find all unmarked graves, as we are expecting the stories to unfold, and there will be more discoveries. So yes, on this Canada Day, I think we have choices. And that choice is either to not celebrate Canada Day because of what's happened and the discovery of the dark pages in our Canadian history. Or we can celebrate Canada Day as before, as if the discoveries have not been made, in so to speak as not to dampen the spirit of Canada Day. But to the National Congress of Chinese Canadians, it is abundantly clear to us that we have a third choice. And that third choice is this: we must use this occasion of the Canada Day in light of recent discoveries of atrocities that have happened to the First Nations people. We must use this day for dialogue. We must use this day for reflection of the First Nations history. We cannot have true reconciliation until we better learn the First Nations history, that the First Nations people have been trying so hard to tell all Canadians, and time and again, including the horrific stories that they have been telling the Canadian people and the government, and to urge them to seek truth of the past that we have so often ignored. And it is sad that it has taken to 2021 and the discovery of massive unmarked graves that the government is now finally taking action because of national attention, including media attention, and also international media attention. So with that, I leave it to our media friends to help spread the words, and I leave it to Canadians to proceed with Canada Day, and hopefully they will reflect deeply on our nation's mistakes, and also to urge our government to expedite their work of seeking truth and reconciliation, and not to take it just for words. And I would like to finish by saying every child in Canada matters, not least the children who have disappeared, regardless of race, regardless of their affiliation, regardless of the color of skin. So with that, I would like to now introduce Howard Grant, Executive Director of the First Nations people. And we are so honored that Howard has agreed to share his thoughts with us at this historical time in Canadian history. Howard.
Thank you, David. Thank you for those kind words of introduction, and more importantly, your message to all of our friends and relatives across Canada that belong to this association. And to formally introduce myself, I'm Howard Grant. My traditional name is Kayapalanoch. It was my great-great-great-grandfather who met the first white man to arrive on our shores in 1791, Captain Narvaez, and then in 1792, Captain Vancouver. I'm also provided and very supportive of the fact that I was given a name within my Chinese family of Hong Mon Heng. And as well, within the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, my name has been provided to me as Wallace Goyam. So I have 3 names that I'm very proud of, along with my English name. So that gives me a lot of strength and background and grounding as to who I am and where I come from. I am the Executive Director of the First Nations Summit, which represents approximately 150 First Nations in British Columbia that deals with the treaty process here in BC. But equally as important, I am an elected member of council for the Musqueam Indian Band, which I have been elected 35 plus years. So I come to you today from the unceded traditional territory of the Humasqueam people that we reside. As a matter of fact, just down the street here, it's a village site called Chesnam, which has been carbon dated to be 4,000 years old. Our main village, as the delta was being formed, was up towards New Westminster, which was carbon dated to be approximately 9,000 years of age. So we've been here for a long time. But as we move forward to the new era, we embraced the white settlers that arrived here with open arms, and we accepted them as part of our family. We also saw a new wave of people coming to our country, which were the Chinese people, mostly from the Guangdong province, and who arrived here. They took up a vision of looking for that gold mountain. But that gold mountain was not just looking for the gold rush, but it was also in regards to other economic opportunities. So as we had Chinese people moving into our territories, taking up, building the railroad in British Columbia, gold mining up in the gold rush areas, as well as becoming entrepreneurial individuals, had restaurants, laundromats, etc. And in my community, we had over 20 plus farms that were located in our village. Because we had a very fertile land that we were able to have approximately 3 to 5 growths during a given year. And as an example, during the Depression, we probably fed the city of Vancouver during that era. So I mention these kinds of things to give you a backdrop or a background or context of our relationship with the Chinese people that has gone for over 120, 150 years plus. That relationship continues to survive today. So with that in mind, I now say thank you to our Asian colleagues who have stood up beside us with regards to what's happened these past few months. I want to acknowledge the fact that 215 unmarked graves were identified in Kamloops. That was followed by Cowasis in Saskatchewan of 751 unmarked graves. And today it was announced that up in Cranbrook, the eastern part of British Columbia, that a further 182 graves, unmarked graves, were found. So as each residential school is being probed by the ground probing radar system that's been provided, we're finding more and more of these. Although we grieve today, I looked to my relatives in my community and around British Columbia that have grieved these many, many, many years. We grieve in a sense of those youth not having the opportunity to enjoy life as you and I have. I also grieve today for those who still survive, the parents, the grandparents, the brothers and sisters, and their cousins who never had a chance to lovingly embrace their loved ones, but they still have them in their memories. And although I'm of mixed emotion at this moment in time to say, am I happy to have found them? Yes, but at the same time, it brings back those traumatic memories that each one of us has embraced over the last 50 to 100 years. You know, each one of us needs further healing to adjust to all of these newfound graves that are being identified at this time. Canada has maintains this magnanimous attitude that they've done something, they've apologized, they've done things to rectify. But if they would only look at the power of the Canadian government, the politicians, and the social elite of this country, things have not changed. We talk about reconciliation, we talk about new relationship, but that can only happen if and when action takes place with a sound work plan, an implementation plan, and a desire and a commitment to make change. Change which results in educating the populace of this country, educating the new Canadians that arrive. We look to the east, to the federal government, and we point a finger, but we also must look to our backs and look at Victoria, another Crown agent, because they too are responsible. They too have a responsibility, because it's education that is the first step in regards to this reconciliation. It needs to be placed into the core curriculum of K-12 and mandatory for at least the first 2 years of university for every Canadian individual to learn the history, the true history of Canada. British Columbia was built on the backs of the Chinese people and on the lands stolen from the Aboriginal people. So today, we look at these kinds of things and it raises the ire of the Native population to say, this is not something new. This is something that we've said time and time and time again in regards to what has happened and what has taken place and has not been corrected. But to have found these unmarked graves raises that issue that we cannot allow it to subside. And we look to our friends and our other ethnic minority groups that have come forward to stand with us, to search for these resolutions to all of what has transpired over this time. Many of us have stood up and said, cancel Canada Day, cancel the celebrations. Some have said, as Mr. Choi has identified, let's continue to celebrate. But with that third choice, that opportunity to make something good happen at this point in time, I choose to continue on, but to continue on in a way that brings resolve to the aspirations of my parents and my grandparents, which is that Canada can be a better place for all of us. The aspiration that there's a better world out there, which is Canada, and that they will truly use and define a magnanimous as something that is positive as opposed to something that we make mockery of. Many, as I said, won't celebrate, and I know that many will. I choose to be educated and to revise and to ensure that the world becomes a better place for all of us. And we need to ensure that those programs and services that each Crown agency, federal and provincial, become responsible in implementing an action plan that both governments have now legislated, DRIPA in the province of British Columbia and UNDRIP in the federal legislation, United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They've also provided an apology to the Chinese populace. They've also created wordsmithing to create legacies, but those are just bronze plaques. We need more than that. We need more than that. We need to fully ensure that history of our two peoples are included in that curriculum so that we can move forward, because right now, under this pandemic, along with this grieving of unmarked graves, racism has come to the fore. It has raised its ugly head and has been identified as Vancouver being one of the most racist areas in North America. We can't continue this path. So with that, I would like to say thank you to our friends. I say thank you to our friends across Canada for standing up and recognizing that genocide just doesn't happen in China or in Europe. It happens here because our children, the young that were beaten when they spoke their language, that they were punished when they tried to practice their culture, and that they were removed from their family environment and became numb and unknown and unknowingly left out in the cold. They became somewhat like zombies. The trauma of seeing and hearing of their relatives and their friends in the school systems being abused or gone because of those unmarked graves. And I say to each one of us, we cannot allow this to continue. We must stand together and have the government implement a plan that has a clear timeline to conclude so that this never, ever happens again. Thank you.
Questions?
Hi, I wonder what are your comments to today's news that 182 remains found again in BC in Cranbrook? What's your comments?
Again, it's something that will be followed by other unmarked graves in other residential school areas throughout British Columbia. My understanding, and I could stand corrected, that BC had the most residential schools in Canada. So I would surely believe that there will be more unmarked graves to be uncovered. My band in particular, we have been utilizing GPR for a number of years already, and we are supporting other First Nations by allowing them to use our system and our database to help develop what they may be finding.
Any plan from the masculine band to do a search together with other bands in the greater Vancouver area? There were several former residential school sites as well.
At the moment, I believe that we haven't heard words from our other relatives on whose lands that these residential schools have been placed. But if called upon, definitely we would be there, because within the greater lower southwest area of BC, many of our population have attended those schools. So yes, we would be looking to support those.
Maybe a question for
Did
David.
you want Frank to offer people in the chat room any questions? If there there's more, any more questions from the floor here?
But on the side, maybe a question for David.
Sure.
So, Mr. Graham, how do you think about the cultural genocide, decided by the chosen?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Yeah. So, how do you, what's your view about the genocide?
Who is speaking?
Rena.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I'm from China. Thank you.
Can you ask Rena to repeat the question and turn the volume up a bit? I can't hear it. I don't think you guys could hear it.
Hi, Rena, can you repeat your question because it's kind of, your
And
voice.
speak louder.
Speak louder.
Yeah.
So I want to Mr. Grant, so how do you like think about the cultural genocide started by the TRC? And do you think is it just a cultural genocide or it's a genocide? Thank you.
Did you hear the question?
Frank, can you turn this volume right up? Frank, can you turn this volume right up on the TV?
Okay.
Huh? Okay, Rena, can you speak, can she hear me? Ask her to speak loudly.
So the
Good.
TRC, they cited the unmarked grave like cultural genocide. So how do you think about that? So what's your view about that, Ms. Grant? Thank you.
As I've said earlier, that with the residential school system, they oftentimes spoke about only the language and that they were physically strapped if and when they were caught speaking their language. But as a whole, the language, the culture of our people, you have to recognize that prior to an educational system that was being provided, that within our family structures, oral dinner table talk and attendance and observation, culture and language were practiced on a daily basis. Now, when you remove a child and place them into a residential school, in reality, it was a prisoner of war camp, to be quite honest about it. And, you're taken away from your language, your culture, your family structure, and that cultural genocide existed from day one because they were supposed to become the teachers of the next generation and the generation after. But if they had none of that culture provided to them, as I said earlier, that these people coming home out of residential school, those that survived, had no language, had no understanding of their culture, and they couldn't even relate to their mothers and fathers and grandparents. Because parents seeing their children for a short period of time, as we all know that in many marriage breakups, that an absentee father coming to a child once every 3 months does not provide a relationship at all. So here you have children and parents that when they did see their child, rather than teaching them and educating them, they embraced them and treated them with love and smothered them in that way, but forgetting what I would call the dinner table talk exercises. It was gone. So then bang, they were back in the residential school. So culture became non-existent. They didn't understand the colonial system, and they had no understanding of of their cultural system. So they became, what did they turn to? They became numb. And they turned to addictions of varying sorts, be it alcohol, drugs, sexual violence, and that's still residual effects of that today. There's no grandparent or child relationship. I hope that answered your question.
No? Any questions from the Zoom panel? No?
Frank, you had a question?
It's about the recent speech by Senator Wu Bao in the Senate on the motion on Xinjiang. I don't know whether you have read his speech in the Senate, and also media reports saying that he voted against the motion. What is your comment on his position and also on his speech?
Well, I'm glad you brought this question up. First, I have not read Senator Powell's speech, but I've heard about it in the news. As for Xinjiang, I have made comments before to say that we cannot make accusations on a definitive basis, as some thinks that they have the right to, without relying on truth. And that is, I'm talking about evidence. And contrary to what others have alluded to, and even with the false presentation of satellite aerial photos that they have called detention camps, etc. When those photos were verified, they were in fact schools, and one was even a condominium complex in China where normal residents live in. So that's how far false accusations have gone. Just by looking at clusters of photos and not understanding how residents and residential buildings are organized in China, and to simply assume, because the structures are different from their culture and in a cluster, they assume it must be a detention camp and call it that and try to expand on it. So I am not in favor of that kind of a bogus, unverified accusation. So I'll leave it at that, because for the Xinjiang matter, on this so-called genocidal actions on the Chinese part, there are real definitions of genocide. And I would refer people back to the United Nations for that definition. And we have yet to see the proof that fits the United Nations definition of genocide in Xinjiang. NCCC have not come to China's defense, nor has NCC come to join in those who accuse China. And that is because we do not have the definitive facts before us at this time. But I can understand Canadians' concern. And if they think there is a concern, I can also understand Canadians of wanting to know what's going on there. And so there is some grounds for the Chinese on China's part to explain so that the world would understand. Okay, yeah. All right, so if there's no other questions, I want to thank everyone for being here. And we do rely on our media friends to carry the message forward with us. And you have come to an understanding today through this conference that there was tremendous linkage between the Chinese and the Aboriginal people through history. This was a time when both peoples were discriminated against. And the only people that the Chinese have been able to find on Canadian soil that have extended kindness and compassion. When the Chinese human rights was violated, mistreated, discriminated against, the First Nations people were the only people as a group that have extended their sincere kindness and compassion. And as I've mentioned, they have exchanged each other's know-how in cooking, in culinary art, because they both have, not just cooking, is culinary art, in farming, irrigation, sewing, clothes making, you name it. And even free love, because they were the first peoples on this land to truly believe in and carried out interracial marriages, which marriage was against the law. And people caught with interracial marriage were jailed. And mothers who have been found to be pregnant with a white person, women or men, were severely punished and jailed even during pregnancy. But because both the First Nations people and the Chinese were both non-white, sometimes they were left alone for a period of time, but they were shunned upon and discriminated against, and they found refuge in one another. So I hope this explains why we're here today, why the National Congress of Chinese Canadians, the one and true national Chinese Canadian organization, as I've mentioned, we were formed in 1992 for the very purpose of fighting for the Chinese head tax redress and for the apology. But our work continues because it's very apparent that racism exists today. Discrimination still exists today. And there are systemic problems that still exist today. And I need to go no further, as Howard has illuminated today, that the systemic problems against the First Nations people still goes on today. So this is the very reason why, as the Chinese would say, for those who have shown us kindness, least we forget, and we have not forgotten. I have come to study Chinese Canadian history at the SFU David Lam Center for International Communications for over 20 years. I was the executive producer of the Canadian Steel Chinese Grid, which was the documentary on the Chinese railway workers. Together with SFU and 6 other national Canadian universities, we've produced the first Chinese Canadian chronological chart, and it was approved by Canada as one of the year 2000 Canadian Millennium Project, the only one of 2 in BC, in fact, that was approved for the Canada Millennium Celebration. And 10 years later, in 2010, we again, with the same 7 Canadian universities, we produced an updated chart. We have yet to produce the 3rd one because of the pandemic, but we hope that this work will certainly carry on. We are determined. And for matters like this before us, what's happening to the First Nations, we find it in our hearts. There was no other way than for us to come forward to say that we stand with the First Nations people in their quest for truth and reconciliation, which work has not been done sufficiently, nor adequately, nor on a timeline basis that meets the aspirations of a Charter on Rights and Freedom of Canada. and of the Canadian people. Because why has Truth and Reconciliation Commission been formed that our government is proud of? And why only in 2021 that we're discovering within a month grave after grave after grave that are unmarked graves? And to the horrific Canadians who don't understand the history, is the Pandora box that opens on the dark pages of Canadian history. And why was Truth and Reconciliation, if the work was done properly, why were these graves not addressed? From countless stories from the survivors of the residential schools who begged to be believed, of their fellow students who disappeared, of parents and grandparents who stepped forward and told the government and the community once and again that they have such grave concerns of the residential schools, and to please and to beg them to please find the children. And why did it take till 2021 June to have discovered 3 graves that are now closing in almost 1,000 unmarked souls that whose death are still back to the future into 2021, yearning out to be discovered and to please address the issue of justice and social justice. So that's really the reason why we're here today. And as I've said, we can use this Canada Day for reflection to move forward, but it must not be a public relations exercise anymore. It must be done in truth, in earnest, and with a plan that we can all be proud of. Can we be proud of the steps that have been taken? We are proud it has been initiated. And I don't think with the discovery of the graves that speaks volume to the truth of the First Nations people who have begged the government and the community to take them up seriously, that we cannot be proud of what has happened, and that the past has not been addressed adequately, nor speedily, nor sufficiently. So I hope in future Canada Day that we can celebrate what has been done between today and the future Canada Days. Not that we have to come back to address these issues with remorse, with agony, with sadness, to again and again to tell ourselves as Canadians that we're not doing good enough. So let us, from today onwards, use this opportunity to take real action. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the meeting.
可以. Okay, there are members who wants me to say a few words in Chinese. Okay. Okay. Okay, you have a question or no? Okay. Any more questions? Any more questions? Last opportunity for the people on the Zoom?
No.
No? Okay. So I want to